millions of civilians across Gaza and Lebanon are facing a catastrophic humanitarian situation.
We've seen families struggle to survive, doing everything they can to keep their loved ones safe.
At times like these,
every year, the United States spends more than $40 billion on foreign aid. The mission? To reduce suffering, build stability, and prevent the rise of extremism. But behind the noble headlines lies a darker reality, allegations that some of this money has found its way into the hands of violent extremist groups. Recently, Congressman Tim Burchett asked a question in a public hearing. Can you name other instances of foreign aid going to terrorist organizations? The list that followed was chilling: Al-Shabaab, Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Kataib Hezbollah, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and even the Taliban. For decades, America has tried to fight terror with one hand, while potentially funding it with the other. This is the story of how aid and extremism collide. To understand these allegations, we must first define foreign aid. U.S. foreign aid falls into three broad categories: humanitarian aid, which provides food, shelter, and healthcare; economic aid, which supports development projects; and military aid, which equips allies with weapons and training. In stable nations, aid can transform lives. But in fragile states, conflict zones, and regions ruled by armed groups, aid is vulnerable to diversion, theft, and exploitation. Foreign aid oversight is shared between USAID, the State Department, and the Pentagon. Strict rules exist, but the battlefield is messy. The Government Accountability Office has reported billions lost to fraud, corruption, and mismanagement. And in places where extremist groups control territory, aid can become a bargaining chip for access, a tax revenue stream, or even direct funding for militants. After the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban returned to power.
Because I'm not a Latino.
Reports revealed that $40 million a week in U.S. cash shipments continued, under the banner of humanitarian support. Supporters say without this aid, millions of Afghan civilians would starve. Critics argue that once the Taliban controls the banks, relief and terror finance become indistinguishable. This is not a new story. From the jungles of Southeast Asia during the Cold War to the deserts of the Middle East today, foreign aid has always been at risk of misuse. The difference now is transparency. With global media, watchdog NGOs, and congressional hearings, the public is learning about connections once hidden behind classified briefings. Experts remain divided. Some argue that aid, even if imperfect, prevents total collapse in fragile nations. Others warn that every dollar diverted strengthens extremists and weakens U.S. credibility. This debate shapes U.S. strategy, foreign policy, and the lives of millions caught between survival and violence. Consider Somalia, where U.S. humanitarian aid has long been vital. Yet reports reveal that Al-Shabaab routinely taxes aid convoys or demands payments from NGOs in exchange for safe passage. Thus, food intended for starving families becomes part of a brutal war economy. In Gaza, U.S. and UN aid is crucial for daily survival. But critics argue that Hamas diverts resources to tunnels, rockets, and its fighters. The question becomes, how do you feed the hungry without empowering those who wage war? In Lebanon, U.S. aid supports the national army and government institutions. Yet Hezbollah, a designated terrorist group, remains deeply embedded in society. Critics argue that aid indirectly stabilizes Hezbollah's influence, while defenders insist it strengthens Lebanon's fragile state. The reality is that aid operates in gray zones. In war zones, money is power. Supplies are leverage. And oversight often ends where violence begins. For the U.S., the challenge is not whether to give aid, but how to ensure it reaches the right hands. This is just the beginning. In this series, we'll investigate claims, examine evidence, and hear from experts on how U.S. foreign aid intersects with extremist groups. From Somalia to Syria, Afghanistan to Gaza, the story is vast, controversial, and deeply human. One truth remains clear: foreign aid is never just charity. It is strategy, it is influence, and sometimes, it is fuel for both hope and conflict. Now, we turn to the most high-profile case, Afghanistan. After 2 decades of war, thousands of U.S. casualties, and trillions of dollars spent, the Taliban once again controls the nation. Yet, astonishingly, reports suggest the United States still sends $40 million in cash every week into a country governed by the very regime it fought for 20 years. August 2021 marked a turning point. As U.S. troops withdrew, the Taliban seized power almost overnight. Hospitals collapsed, banks froze, and millions faced starvation. The U.S. and international partners responded with cash aid injections, meant to stabilize the economy and prevent humanitarian disaster. But here lies the dilemma: how do you inject money into a country entirely ruled by the Taliban? Without empowering the Taliban itself, every week, pallets of U.S. dollars, often totaling $40 million, arrive in Afghanistan. They are deposited into the central bank in Kabul, which is now overseen by Taliban-appointed officials. The official story: the funds are distributed through United Nations agencies to pay for healthcare, food assistance, and government worker salaries. The unofficial fear: that the Taliban takes its cut, siphoning millions into its war chest. Supporters of the program argue that without this cash lifeline, millions of Afghans would face famine. Aid agencies insist strict monitoring exists, payments go directly to workers, hospitals, and humanitarian projects. They point out, starving populations create fertile ground for extremism. Humanitarian aid, therefore, is not weakness, it's prevention. Critics are unconvinced. They argue that once money enters Taliban-controlled institutions, oversight collapses. The regime can skim off salaries, tax aid agencies, or simply pressure workers into handing over funds. Former officials warn, money is fungible. Every dollar that stabilizes the Taliban's economy allows them to spend elsewhere, on fighters, weapons, and propaganda. To understand the stakes, we must see Afghanistan today. The Taliban rules through strict Islamic law. Women are barred from education. Dissent is silenced. Yet government employees still line up for their monthly paychecks largely funded by foreign aid dollars. For the average Afghan, survival depends on this aid. But it also means their daily lives remain tethered to Taliban-controlled. In Afghanistan's hospitals, U.S. aid funds doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. Yet reports show Taliban officials demanding a percentage of salaries, effectively turning humanitarian assistance into forced taxation. Doctors continue to work, patients receive treatment, but behind the scenes, the Taliban profits from the very aid meant to bypass them. These cash flows do not stay confined to Afghanistan. Analysts warn that aid indirectly stabilizes Taliban alliances with groups in Pakistan, Central Asia, and beyond. Money helps them maintain networks, buy loyalty, and expand influence. Thus, the question grows larger: is the world funding not just Afghanistan's survival, but the Taliban's rise? For Afghan citizens, the debate feels abstract. They only know hunger, poverty, and fear. One mother says, "Without the aid, my children would die." Another man counters, "The Taliban grows rich while we remain poor." This dual reality defines Afghanistan today, a population dependent on the very aid that may strengthen their rulers. According to watchdog reports, since 2021, over $3.5 billion in aid has flowed into Afghanistan. No one can fully track how much reaches civilians, and how much slips into Taliban control. The numbers are staggering. The accountability? Still in question. In the end, the Taliban's billions reveal the core dilemma of foreign aid in conflict zones. Can you help the people, without helping their rulers? In Afghanistan, the answer remains painfully unclear. And as we'll see in the next chapter, this dilemma is not unique. From Somalia to Sudan, the same cycle repeats: aid intended for peace ends up feeding war. In the Horn of Africa lies Somalia, a nation scarred by decades of war, famine, and fragile governance. For years, the United States has poured millions in aid into Somalia, hoping to fight poverty and weaken the terror group Al-Shabaab. But reports reveal a troubling reality: Al-Shabaab has mastered the art of exploiting humanitarian assistance. By taxing aid convoys, extorting NGOs, and infiltrating distribution networks, the group has turned relief into revenue. Tonight, we explore how Somalia's aid lifeline became a battlefield between survival and extremism. Somalia has not had a fully functional central government since 1991. Power struggles, clan rivalries, and terrorism have left the country deeply unstable. In this vacuum, Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, controls large territories, imposing its own laws, taxes, and checkpoints. This makes aid distribution a dangerous gamble. Here is how aid is supposed to work. Shipments of food, water, and medicine arrive by ship or plane, are processed in Mogadishu, and then distributed by NGOs across the country. But in practice, every truck must pass through checkpoints often controlled by Al-Shabaab. At each stop, the group demands zakat, or tax payments, before letting the convoy proceed. The result? Food for the starving becomes cash for the fighters. NGOs face a terrible choice: refuse to pay and risk aid never reaching villages, or comply and fund terrorism. Many quietly admit to paying these fees, calling them the cost of survival. The U.S. officially prohibits aid money from funding Al-Shabaab. But on the ground, survival often outweighs compliance. During the famine of 2011, when 250,000 Somalis died, Al-Shabaab blocked aid agencies it accused of working with the West. At the same time, the group taxed others, ensuring it profited from a crisis of biblical proportions. Even as children starved, the business of war thrived. Experts document several methods of diversion. Taxing aid convoys. Demanding security fees from NGOs. Diverting aid trucks into black markets. Recruiting staff within aid agencies to funnel supplies. Every sack of rice, every container of medicine, is vulnerable to exploitation. For ordinary Somalis, aid is both a blessing and a curse. One farmer explains, "If aid comes, we survive. But if Al-Shabaab takes it, we starve again." Others say, "We must hide aid rations or the fighters will seize them." For civilians caught in the middle, survival means silence. On paper, U.S. policy is clear: no funds to Al-Shabaab. In reality, aid agencies navigate an impossible environment. Some officials argue this is unavoidable: if aid is withheld entirely, millions could die. Others counter, every compromise makes Al-Shabaab stronger. This is the paradox of Somalia. Why does Somalia matter to the United States? Because Al-Shabaab has grown from a local insurgency into a regional threat, launching attacks in Kenya, Uganda, and beyond. U.S. officials fear that unchecked, Al-Shabaab could again provide a safe haven for international terrorists, much like Afghanistan did in 2001. Over the past decade, dozens of aid workers in Somalia have been kidnapped, attacked, or killed by Al-Shabaab. The group views aid not as charity, but as leverage and propaganda. By targeting humanitarian workers, they send a message: nothing enters Somalia without their approval. In Somalia, the fight for survival collides directly with the fight against terrorism. Every aid truck, every food sack, every dollar must pass through the shadow of Al-Shabaab. For the U.S., the lesson is sobering. Even with the best intentions, foreign aid can become fuel for those it was meant to defeat. In the heart of Africa lies Sudan, a country torn by civil war, coups, and humanitarian crises. For decades, the United States and international agencies have provided billions in aid to help Sudan's people. But behind the chaos, a powerful and shadowy group, the Hamza Network, has emerged. This little-known network, operating within Sudan's fractured state, has become a silent broker of aid, siphoning supplies and funding for its own gain. Tonight, we uncover how foreign aid in Sudan has been twisted into a tool of power, fueling corruption and conflict. Sudan's story is one of endless upheaval, from Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship to the secession of South Sudan in 2011, to recent clashes between the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces. Amid this turmoil, aid has always been a lifeline, but also a political weapon. In this environment, groups like the Hamza Network thrive, the Hamza Network is not a government agency, nor a traditional rebel group. Instead, it is a shadow organization, part militia, part business cartel, part political machine. Through connections with military officers, businessmen, and foreign intermediaries, it inserts itself into the flow of aid, food shipments, medical supplies, even refugee camp budgets. Its role is hidden, but its profits are enormous. The Hamza Network exploits aid in several ways. Diverting trucks before they reach refugee camps. Skimming portions of medical supplies to sell on the black market. Forcing NGOs to pay protection fees for safe passage. Laundering aid funds through shell companies. Every step of the aid chain, from donor pledges in Washington to deliveries in Darfur, offers opportunities for theft. In Darfur, where conflict has displaced millions, the Hamza Network has turned tragedy into commerce. Reports from NGOs show that up to 40% of food aid disappears before it reaches camps. Those who control distribution often wear two faces. By day, local coordinators for aid groups; by night, operatives for the Hamza Network. Where does the money go? Investigators believe diverted aid is sold in Sudan's markets, with profits funneled into the Hamza Network's coffers. From there, the money supports three pillars. Militia payrolls to maintain armed control. Political influence, bribing officials to look the other way. Business investments, blending illicit profits with legitimate trade. This cycle ensures the Hamza Network survives regardless of Sudan's shifting governments. Ordinary Sudanese describe living between dependency and exploitation. A mother in Darfur recalls, "When aid trucks come, we feel hope. But when they leave, the men with guns take most of it." An NGO worker admits, "If we expose the Hamza Network, we may never work here again." So we stay silent. Since the 1990s, U.S. aid to Sudan has been framed as both humanitarian relief and a tool for stabilizing the region. But American policymakers admit aid delivery is compromised. One report warned, a significant portion of aid never reaches intended beneficiaries, undermining U.S. strategic goals. In other words, U.S. dollars are not just feeding the hungry, they are feeding corruption. The U.S. is not alone. The United Nations and EU also face the same problem. Do you pull out and risk famine? Or stay, knowing your presence strengthens shadow networks like Hamza? For now, the world continues to send aid, hoping at least some of it reaches the people. When Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019, Sudanese protesters demanded freedom and accountability. But behind the scenes, the Hamza Network adapted quickly. While the government changed, the network remained. In chaotic transitions, their grip on aid tightened, proving they are not tied to leaders, only to power itself. In Sudan, aid is not just about survival. It is currency in a shadow economy controlled by the Hamza Network. For every sack of flour delivered, another is stolen. For every family fed, another is left hungry. For the U.S., the lesson is clear: aid without accountability strengthens those who exploit chaos. In our next episode, we travel west to Nigeria, where the fight against Boko Haram reveals another chapter in the dangerous politics of aid. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, rich in oil, culture, and history. Yet for over a decade, it has been plagued by one of the world's most feared extremist groups, Boko Haram. In its wake, millions displaced, tens of thousands killed, and entire towns destroyed. The United States has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into aid, security, and counter-terrorism efforts. But in the chaos of northern Nigeria, aid itself has become a target, and a prize. This episode investigates how U.S. and international aid, meant to heal, often fuels the very insurgency it seeks to stop. Boko Haram, whose name translates to "Western education is forbidden," began as a small religious sect in 2002. By 2009, it evolved into a violent insurgency, pledging allegiance to ISIS and launching terror campaigns across Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. The group's ideology is extreme. But its survival is practical: food, weapons, and money. And that's where aid becomes part of the story. The U.S., through USAID and humanitarian partners, sends aid to northern Nigeria, food for refugees, medical supplies for the displaced, and funding for counter-terrorism programs. But in territories where Boko Haram operates, delivering aid is dangerous. Convoys are hijacked, aid workers kidnapped, and supplies looted. Sometimes, Boko Haram itself taxes aid deliveries, allowing them through in exchange for payments, turning relief into revenue. The Lake Chad Basin, where Nigeria meets Chad, Cameroon, and Niger, is home to over 3 million displaced people. US and UN aid keeps millions alive. Yet, the same supply routes are lifelines for Boko Haram. Multiple reports reveal Boko Haram fighters frequently raid food warehouses and extort local communities that receive aid. In effect, aid becomes a tax system under Boko Haram's shadow rule. The US doesn't just send food, it sends military support. Over $600 million in security aid has flowed to Nigeria since 2015, funding weapons, training, and intelligence. Yet, corruption within Nigeria's security forces has allowed weapons and funds to be diverted. Some US-supplied equipment has even ended up in Boko Haram's hands. A bitter irony, the fight against terror arming the terrorists themselves. In Maiduguri, the capital of Borno State, refugees describe living between two fears, hunger and Boko Haram. One father says, "We wait for the trucks. Sometimes they come. Sometimes they are stolen. When Boko Haram takes them, we starve." For aid workers, the danger is constant. Since 2010, dozens have been killed or kidnapped while trying to deliver supplies. Congressional oversight has flagged these problems. Reports warn. High risk of aid diversion in insurgent-controlled zones. Weak accountability in Nigeria's security forces undermines U.S. goals. Still, the aid continues. Policymakers argue that without it, millions more would die, even if some is lost to insurgents. Should aid be halted if some of it strengthens terrorists? Critics say yes, warning that every bag of stolen grain buys Boko Haram loyalty. Defenders argue no, insisting that starving civilians is far worse than occasional diversion. It is a paradox with no easy answer, one repeated in conflict zones worldwide. That in 2014, Boko Haram kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in Chibok, shocking the world. Behind the headlines, negotiations for their release reportedly involved ransom payments, raising questions of whether international money indirectly enriched Boko Haram. If true, this means even well-intentioned rescue efforts may have funded future terror. In northern Nigeria, the struggle is relentless. Aid meant to fight suffering becomes a prize for those spreading it. For the U.S., the Nigerian case is a warning: in conflict zones, aid is never neutral. Every truck that rolls carries not just food, but the weight of war. In our next episode, we shift to the Middle East, and to Hamas in Gaza, where U.S. aid faces perhaps its most controversial test. In the densely packed strip of land along the Mediterranean, Gaza stands as one of the world's most contested territories. For decades, it has been the focus of war, politics, and endless humanitarian crises. The United States has long provided aid to the Palestinian people: food, medicine, infrastructure support, and development funding. But critics warn that aid meant for civilians has been siphoned by Hamas, the group that governs Gaza and is designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. Hamas was founded in 1987 during the First Intifada as an Islamist offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Its ideology calls for resistance against Israel and the establishment of an Islamic State in historic Palestine. While it runs schools, hospitals, and social services, its military wing, the Is ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, has carried out suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and armed conflict. For Washington, this dual identity creates a dilemma: how to deliver aid to civilians without empowering Hamas. Since the 1990s, U.S. foreign aid to Palestinians has totaled billions of dollars. The fund support: food and humanitarian relief, infrastructure repair, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, security and governance programs in the West Bank. But in Gaza, where Hamas rules, aid delivery becomes a minefield of politics and control. Multiple reports allege Hamas has diverted aid in several ways. Seizing materials like cement, using them for tunnel construction instead of homes. Taxing aid deliveries, collecting revenue from every truck that enters. Controlling distribution, favoring loyalists and using scarcity as leverage. In short, aid becomes not just relief, but a weapon of governance. After the 2014 Gaza war, billions in international aid were pledged for reconstruction. Yet, Israeli and international monitors accused Hamas of diverting cement and steel for military tunnels. The paradox was stark. Materials sent to rebuild schools were instead reinforcing bunkers and rocket launch sites. For Gaza's 2 million residents, aid is a lifeline. A father says, "Without the food boxes, my children would starve." But we know the men with power control what comes in. An aid worker adds, "We deliver to the warehouses." After that, we cannot guarantee where it goes. To prevent diversion, the U.S. has placed strict rules on Palestinian aid. Funds cannot go directly to Hamas. Monitoring systems track deliveries. Contractors must pass vetting checks. Yet, in practice, complete separation is impossible. In a territory run by Hamas, every delivery is subject to its influence. In 2021, another war erupted between Israel and Hamas. After the ceasefire, Washington announced over $360 million in new aid for Palestinians. Immediately, critics warned, would this money rebuild lives, or bankroll the next rocket? Inside the U.S., aid to Palestinians is fiercely debated. Supporters argue it is humanitarian, not political, ensuring children eat, hospitals function, and families survive. Opponents insist any dollar that passes through Hamas-controlled territory inevitably strengthens the group's grip. It is one of the most polarizing aid debates in modern U.S. foreign policy. In Gaza, aid is not just humanitarian. It is political, strategic, and deeply contested. For the U.S., the question remains. Can you truly separate the people from the rulers in a land where one controls the other? Every sack of flour feeds a child. But it may also feed the system that keeps conflict alive. In our next episode, we move deeper into the Middle East, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, where U.S. aid and terror financing intersect in even more complex ways.